Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Tallberg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at tallbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World. We live in an increasingly complex, technology-driven world. How we learn, how we create, how we make and grow things, how we interact with each other is being transformed by new technologies that themselves are rapidly evolving. In a perfect world, this technological transformation would lift all boats, make people smarter, healthier, more prosperous, maybe even wiser and more human. I suppose we could debate whether that's possible or perhaps even desirable, but not today. Today, I want to have a conversation about what might be considered the precondition for navigating, never mind prospering, in a high-tech age, human competence. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, recently published the results of a massive study of adult skills in 31 countries in Europe, the Americas, and East Asia, essentially the major democracies of the world. The bad news: adult literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving skills are declining or stagnating in almost all of those countries. No wonder so many people in so many places seem dissatisfied, seem to fear the future, not embrace it. And no wonder democracy seems to be in trouble in so many of those countries. My guest today is Andreas Schleicher, Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, who oversaw the organization's Survey of Adult Skills. Andreas has as good an understanding of the state of global education, and more particularly of global adult skills, as anyone. Welcome, Andreas, to New Thinking for a New World.
Thanks for hosting me, Alan.
Normally, Andreas, I'd want to focus on solutions, and I hope we get there if we have time. But I found your survey so disheartening, so frightening, actually, that I think we need to concentrate on the actual findings. If I'm reading the numbers right, on average across these 31 countries, essentially the democracies of Europe, North America, and parts of East Asia, as well as others, more than 1/4 of people are in the lowest performing categories. That's a shock.
It is, because that lowest performing category is what you'd expect from a 10-year-old child. I think level 1 is really very basic in terms of the kind of knowledge and skills that people have. But it is very clear that there are significant shares of workers without even the most basic foundations. What is also worrying that share in most countries has been growing. It's not that the average has dropped. It's that the share of people with very low skills has increased. Now, it's not everybody's skills have declined, but we've seen a polarization in the skills distribution. On the one hand, highly skilled people have generally maintained their skills, but at the low end, we've seen skills dropping. And not in every country. That's also, there are some countries that have bucked that trend, but certainly in most.
In terms of numbers, as I went through the report, I was shocked. The United States, for example, 28% of adults are in the lowest literacy space and 1/3 of adults in the lowest numeracy space. Germany and the UK, more or less 1 in 5 in both categories. There are exceptions, as you just said, but some of the biggest democracies are performing, if not the worst, are performing abysmally.
In part, what is also worrying is that it's often the young population. You have the United States is a good example. If you look among older adults, it fares actually quite well, certainly a lot better than the average of the countries that we're looking at here. But if you look at young people moving into the labor market, that's where the relative standing of the United States has considerably dropped. So we have Singapore would be the opposite example. The old generation didn't benefit from much schooling and shows pretty low literacy skills, but the young generation now performs on top. I think that shows us that those things can be addressed. But again, in most of the democracies, we have seen the problem worsening. In literacy, and that's also an important finding. In numeracy, the trend has been much more nuanced, has been more stagnation than dropping, which really shows it's not that people have got more stupid. It's more that certain kinds of information processing skills that are so vital in the times in which we live are becoming more difficult to develop. And you said at the beginning, technology, of course, is a superpower for all of us, but it could also lead people to just engage less with more complex information. You ask yourself, the type of information that you read 10 years ago and that you read now. 10 years ago, we engaged with a lot more complex information. We had to, contrast, critique, look at problems from multiple angles. Today, we read snippets of short pieces of text, and that, may have contributed to the picture that we see.
This isn't a question, and it's not even a kosher editorial comment. I've long been persuaded that 160 character discipline that was imposed a few years ago in certain social media platforms that remain nameless was the destruction of civilization as we know it. But that's a different point. I want to pull on a bunch of the threads that you've just left hanging, but maybe we go back to the study itself. You surveyed 160,000 adults across 31 countries, ages 16 to 65, not currently in education. So these are adults in the workforce, or at least not in school. Looking at these three dimensions: literacy, numeracy, and problem solving. Can you give us a definition of what do you mean, and you've just hinted at it in the complexity answer, what do you mean by those three? What is literacy, what is numeracy, and problem solving?
Yeah, first of all, what makes this study so interesting is that it's the only comparisons that looks at the skills of people directly. There are a lot of ways to compare the qualification of people, where you studied, how long you studied, what subjects you choose, basically just looking at formal qualifications that people attain. That's not, about this study. This study is a direct assessment of the skills people actually have. So we went to people's household, and tested their skills. When I look at literacy, it starts with very basic, questions. Level one, essentially. When you talked about, quarter of adults not mastering level one, that's basically just extracting a simple statement from a very short text. And then it goes up to level 5 and 6, where you have to contrast, critique, maybe distinguish, fact from opinion, and so on. So there's a range of literacy tasks that we pose to people, and then we estimate their performance. Numeracy as well. It starts from, just, adding and subtracting simple numbers, and then, building, some form of relationships in mathematics. Up to quite complicated tasks. And problem solving, what we looked at here was basically your capacity to engage with dynamic problems. What you often face in the digital world is that the problem that presents itself to you changes while you actually work on it. And that's the kind of things that we looked at here. So, but again, ranging from very simple tasks to quite complex ones.
Your report gives the example of a problem-solving item, the best route problem.
Yeah.
You just describe that so people get a sense of what you mean by a complex problem in practical terms.
Yeah, and that was actually already a pretty tough problem for many people. It's basically you get a map and you have to determine how do you move away from point A to B, and then maybe picking up something at point C. So you have to do some basic planning, some calculations. Figure out, how you do this in the most efficient way. And actually, this is a problem where many people had real difficulties with. Surprisingly, you look at actually most of the tasks and you ask yourself, how could anybody get those things wrong? But again, there are significant shares of people in our populations that struggle with those kinds of tasks. No?
Well, and looking at the results, 29%, almost a third of people across the OECD are in that level 1 or less in terms of problem solving. And only, which is almost as shocking to me at least, only 5% on average are in the upper category. Everybody else is in the middle. But 29 and 5 is a pretty big, that's a barbell that doesn't balance.
Yeah, in the past, our economies were run by a few people who, made decisions about everybody else, and most people worked for those people. And then you can say, okay, 5% in that category is actually, perhaps what is required. Today, you need everybody. That's the big difference. Today, the economic, the social, the political cost of having people at the very bottom end of the distribution are of a totally different dimension. Low-skilled jobs are evaporating, at least, really decently paid low-skilled jobs. And at the high end of the skilled spectrum, technology becomes a lot more demanding, and not just in economic life, in social life, in civic life. These days, technology often, confronts you with information that reinforces, your own perspective, your own belief. It's actually harder to, get out of those kinds of bubble. You need a fair amount of, information literacy to, build a complex mental representation of information. And that's pretty hard for many people.
As I read the report, Finland is one of the stars in this world of competence. What surprised me was your data showing that Finnish high school graduates consistently outperform adults with much more education in countries like Chile, Israel, Spain, Italy, and almost as well as college-educated adults in the US, France, and Canada. What have the Finns got right, almost uniquely so across the board?
Finland has a really interesting history of literacy. Literacy really played a very important role for hundreds of years. In fact, you couldn't get married in Finland, a century ago without demonstrating basic literacy. So it had a very, very strong status in society. In education, Finns read a lot. There's a lot of engagement with reading. There's a lot of engagement with, complex reading, fiction, all of that. And in fact, that's what when we do these similar surveys for young people, that's what the data show. It's people who have those kinds of reading habits, who develop them early, who continue to expand their horizon later on. And Finland is a good example of that, where this has, a high status, not just economic, it's not just reading to do your job, but it's actually reading as a way of engaging, with other people, with society, and and the other part that we can learn from Finland is that they place strong emphasis early on that everybody acquires those skills. So you do not see as strong a relationship between social and economic, background of people and their literacy skills. But in Finland, they do pay real attention to ensure that every child masters the foundations in reading in school early on, and then they have a pathway in front of them where they can build on that. Strong foundations in school in literacy, and as you say, there are many countries in which even at college level, people do not reach those levels because often we have a large share of adults who are left behind on that.
One of the interesting results, one of the many interesting results of this work is the emphasis you put on competence inequality. We're used to discussions about economic inequality, about gender inequality, about other forms of inequality. I've never seen documentation of a competence inequality. They're all intertwined, of course, and your work demonstrates that. But I find it frightening that the competence inequality, as we already mentioned in the past, seems to be growing.
Yeah, and I think this competence inequality is a very, very important concept. In our societies, economies, we have many ways to deal with the, fallout, the consequences of inequality. You can use taxes to take money from the rich, give it to the poor, and so on. You can redistribute what is there. But, skills are perhaps our only, hope to address the sources of inequality. Dealing with the consequences is often ineffective, is expensive, and puts lots of tensions into our societies. Now, redistribution is always contentious, but addressing skills inequality is actually your best bet to make sure that everybody plays on a level playing field, that everybody has the chance to collaborate, compete, and connect based on their own potential. So I think that investment is incredibly important, and we can actually show that. inequality in skills translates almost directly into income inequality, into social inequality, into democratic, inequality and civic inequality. You can see, for example, people at the high end of the skill distribution have a lot more, trust in society. They're much more likely to volunteer, to give back something to society. So it matters on almost any front. No? And we either, run behind to, fix the outcomes of inequality, or we address the sources of it. And that's where the skills inequality is so critically important, making sure that every young person gets a decent level of foundation skills is something I think that a country like Finland is delivering on now. And Japan as well. It's not just Finland. You can find a bunch of countries that actually have placed emphasis on that and done well.
What do War Lessons from Gaza, Rethinking Education, Peace in Ukraine and Visionary Leadership have in common? They are all themes from recent episodes of this podcast. Check out more episodes on tallbergfoundation.org or on a platform of your choice.
My knee-jerk reaction would have been more education solves this problem. What I found very surprising is that doesn't seem to be the case, that more education does not correlate to solving the competence problem. And in fact, if I remember the numbers correctly, even worse, tertiary educated graduates, people with beyond high school education, proficiency decreased or stagnated in a lot of countries. So it isn't education, or at least it's not education dollars or education euros. There's something else going on. Why is there a mismatch between education as we think about it and competence?
That's why we actually measure the skills of people directly, because for a long time we have seen that, that massive expansion in the share of people with college degrees has not led to, a corresponding rise in skills of people. It's deeply troubling, actually, when you think about it. We have a lot more young people now going into college, graduating, but you look at the, proficiency levels for a country like the United States, it has barely changed over the last decade. And I think that's something that we need to heart, that, just spending more on education or pushing people for longer through those processes is not a guarantee for actually developing their levels of knowledge and skills. And that's why measuring those things directly is very, very important. We see, for example, sometimes, you can learn a lot at the workplace. Vocational education and training can be, an effective way to actually equip yourself. Learning at the workplace. Sweden and Canada are interesting countries where actually these data show people continue to build their skills. There's a lot of opportunity for people to develop new skills. There are interesting ways to recognize skills. These countries are moving away from, formal degrees and qualifications towards, systems that are more nuanced, equipping people with micro-credentials, giving people more ownership over what they learn and how they learn and where they learn. And in fact, when in their lives they learn. Now, I think moving away from stacking up lumpy qualifications up front in your life towards learning throughout your life and developing competency. And once again, those competencies, yes, you can develop some of them in formal educational setting, but there's also lots of opportunities in life where you can actually expand your own skills. But it, of course, depends on the workplace. I think great places of work are great places of learning these days. No? And but not every workplace is like that.
But it is the case that most CEOs I know, at least of big companies, assume that they have not just an obligation, but also the necessity to provide not just training, but education, and to keep at it over the course of a long career. So we're not developing the lifelong learning concept as much in the public sectors as we are in the private sector, although in a very, very spotty fashion is my impression.
Yeah, it is true. Actually, I think even the private sector often can do a lot more. There's a lot of variability across countries. There are some some countries where, learning and working is very closely integrated, and where it's actually, workplaces are very permeable to new skills. If you, acquire new skills, you get a better, job. You can move to the place where you can use your skills best. And there are countries where you get locked into a job and nobody sees your skills in a direct way. So I think there's a lot of variation. I think both in the public and private sector, moving towards a society in which, that curiosity, that, willingness to expand your horizon is really, part of life. And I think that's very important that we move more into that direction. When we actually surveyed people, that did not go to training, that did not expand, their own learning. Why didn't you do it? It was not primarily money or time. The most important reason was that people said, I don't need it for my job. Now, the awareness that in the modern, in the past, we used to learn to do our work, and now learning is the work. If you live in a kind of modern workplace, if you do not move on, if you do not, look beyond what you currently do, you'll be pretty quickly out of date, particularly, as technology, comes into all of this. So I think we are still quite far away from, building that kind of context.
Part of the problem, of course, is that what you are saying is that people need to understand that their job is complexity and uncertainty. Their life is complex and uncertain. Yet at the same time, too many of our societies put up safety and cognitive safety, physical safety, every definition of safety as the purpose of society. And you get that conflict. So the result is stagnation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think what we often miss out is that idea of, cognitive, social, emotional resilience. Can you reinvent yourself when the world around changes? Now, can you actually, find your right place in this world today and tomorrow? Can you live in an imbalanced world? Now, I think that level of resilience is incredibly important. We can see actually it's pretty closely correlated with people's propensity to learn. Where people just aim for stability, you try to keep the world in balance. Where you actually accept instability, you learn to live in an imbalanced world. And I think that's something often, even in education, we try to, educate young people for a stable world rather than equipping them with the tools to, engage with ambiguity, with complexity, and, thrive in uncertainty. And I think that's something that you do pay a high price for. You can say on one hand, humans were born with this amazing ability to constantly learn, but we lose that pretty quickly. This is not from this study, but we tested creativity for 10 and 15-year-olds, and we could see that in most countries, 15-year-olds were less creative than 10-year-olds. Because, our systems gear you towards, compliance rather than, resilience. And I think that's something that you can see later in life then.
And is deadly. It's deadly for economy. It's deadly for democracy. And it's certainly deadly in a world that is changing as fast as this. The work you did looks at implications of skill levels for health, for life satisfaction, for trust, and for other dimensions of actually how people live. My sense of the results, although they're so complex, I'm not sure that summing them up in a single sentence is possible. It seemed that the relationship between skill levels, and health seemed to be quite strong across many countries, somewhat less so in terms of life satisfaction and trust. But is there a way to summarize or across countries, or are there any themes that come out of that part of the work?
Skills are positively related to almost any social outcome that we measure, whether it's health, life satisfaction, trust, volunteering, and so on. I think there's a positive relationship, but it varies. It varies across countries, context, and for health, yes, you see a strong relationship. It's not so clear what's cause and effect. Probably, people with poorer skills get the kind of jobs that, are less healthy. So we could see, health outcomes being driven indirectly. But, when you look at trust in society, that I think is a pretty, clear relationship. If you, can move in this society, if you understand the society, you will trust the world you see in front of you. If you do not understand it, if you can't engage it, and literacy is the window to the world. Now, if you do not master those literacy skills, you do not have the tools to understand this world, to interact with this world. And then, of course, you lose confidence, you lose trust, you disengage. And so many of those relationships are quite easy to understand, and they're all positive. Now, in some countries a bit stronger, and some a little bit less. But I think the direction of travel is very clear. That literacy is a very clear economic enabler. Employment depends on that. Earnings depend on that. But also very much a civic and social enabler. What modern democracy requires from people is, to build agency, to engage with the world, to take responsibility, to take ownership, and all of that depends on those foundation skills. No?
And this is one of those places where the inequality in skills is so important. Looking specifically at trust, because it's clearly the entry point into a lot of the discussions of democracy. If you don't trust, you cannot be a good citizen. Country after country after country, a big gap between the least skilled and the most skilled around that variable of trust. It's true particularly in the United States and Germany, but it's true in a lot of the European and North American countries.
I agree very much. I think that trust is the foundation on which we make decisions, relate to people who are different from us. In a way, we're all born with bonding social capital. We relate well to people who are like us, like our family. But to build that bridging social capital, where you are able and willing to extend your radius of trust to strangers, to institutions, that really builds on knowledge, on understanding this world around you. And again, where you miss that, you will lose that trust. And that trust is the glue that holds together our societies.
Andreas, this study is an absolutely brilliant snapshot, and indeed a movie, because this is the second you have done, snapshot of skills across essentially the democracies. As we've been discussing, most of the news is difficult. The obvious, and it's headed in the wrong direction in most cases, both because, as you said, compared to the student testing, but also the longitudinal testing, we're headed in the wrong direction in general. The obvious question, which is not the purpose of your study, is why? And I hesitate to ask, it's an unfair question, but why?
Yeah, cross-sectional studies never give you much clue about cause and effect here. But, I think there are some observations warranted, The fact that the declines in outcomes are much sharper in literacy than in numeracy. So they're not a general decline in skills. They're a specific decline in literacy. I do think at least correlates with the way in which we engage with information. Now, we are much less likely to encounter complex information. We could actually see when we did a similar study of 15-year-olds, our PISA study, that one of the best predictor for you to be digitally literate was actually the share of students who had read books over 100 pages. And you ask yourself, how can that be that the kids who play, all the time with a computer do worse than kids who read books? And the answer is, well, when you read a long book, you have to build a complex mental representation. You have to, engage with different characters who represent different perspectives. You actually have to perform many of the tasks that you require in the modern world, navigating ambiguity, integrating complexity, distinguishing, fact from fiction and opinion. And often that is less and less the case in the way in which we engage with information. In a way, it's not that, computers have become more like humans. It's more like humans have degraded some of the literacy skills to what computers are very good at, processing, information. And I think that's, one interpretation. I can't say that is the cause or the primary cause, but it's certainly, one factor we should take into account, given that we do not see a similar picture in numeracy. The other part is, increasing social differences that we see in our societies. Now, that's also something that, plays out in some countries more than in others. And again, we need to, take that to heart, that the impact of social diversity has increased in many countries, and the impact of that diversity on outcomes has increased as well. Our societies do often less well to ensure that, people from all income groups have similar educational opportunities than we used to do.
The other obvious factor potentially is the technology itself. Whether technology is being allowed to substitute for the kinds of complex thinking processes, whether in literacy or numeracy, indeed in problem solving. I'm thinking of people who used to know how to read a map and now just tell their car where they want to go and are given directions so they don't have to problem solve. Using the example that you gave of how would you do this, the answer probably for many people would be, well, I'd ask GPS to tell me how to do it. So I'm wondering if we are we haven't figured out how to use this technology creatively. Rather, we use it to allow us to become dependent.
Yeah, and I think in a way, technology is not a magic power. It's an incredible amplifier, an amazing accelerator. If you can use it, to depend on it, I think that's very clear. And then some of your skills may indeed atrophy. I think your example of Google Maps is a good one. I think we've lost our sense of orientation by relying on those kinds of tools. At the same time, technology can also super empower your cognitive and social emotional skills. I think it's very much, how we as humans take that up. But I worry that increasing trend towards a consumptive use of technology rather than a creative use of technology leads us, to trade in, trade our freedom in for convenience, and our intellectual autonomy.
I fear that you are exactly right. I think that is a perfect summary. But let me ask you one last question. You've been immersed in this data for years. You've been thinking about it. You've been plotting it. You've been planning it. You've been executing it. What most surprised you in this last survey?
Actually, and we have not yet published this, but when I saw that picture, 10 years ago, I thought, maybe we are losing some things, but we also gain some things. And we have, in this second round, not only looked at literacy, numeracy, and problem solving, but we're also starting to look at some workplace skills. How do you manage yourself? Can you live with people who are different from you, and so on? And that's going to be published later this year. And I think the question really is: are we just losing things, or are we also developing new things that we may not, have had to that extent in the past? And we're currently working on analyzing those kinds of factors. Because if I look at it at the face of it, the fact that we live in a society of rising skill demands, basically in the past, our societies were pretty tolerant to low-skilled people. You could even get a decent job with a good wage without having, great skills. You could pass by. Today, without, level 1 literacy, you can't even buy a bus ticket. So I think our societies have become increasingly reliant on skills, and the fact that there is this growing gap between the skills people have and what they require, it's a surprise. But again, we might find that humans have developed some other capabilities that are also important, and that's something that we're going to look at in the next year.
And to make the point you just made, again, if a quarter of our citizens don't have the skill set to buy a bus ticket, we're in trouble.
It's actually that may actually be also surprising in itself. To ask yourself, every fourth person you meet on the street can get by. The people develop coping strategies but then you see on the other side of the equation, they get poorer jobs, they get less income, they have less means to engage with our civic kind of environment. And I think we as a society just pay a steep price for not taking better care of what makes us human in the end, and that is our skills. No?
Andreas, let us leave it there. Thank you very much for this conversation. I'm not sure I'm going to sleep tonight, but nonetheless, thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at tallbergfoundation.org.